Okay, to start with then, I'll introduce myself. My name is Paul Smith. I'm the course director at Coventry University on the BA Photography course. And I'm here today to talk about my work and my background, my history, and why I've produced some of the work that I've produced. So to start with, the best way for me to present my work is looking at it as a historical overview. So I'm going to go right the way back to when I was a young, fresh-faced 16-year-old, when I made the dubious decision of joining the British Army. That's me within the first week of joining the Army, and I know I've hardly changed a bit since then. Just got a slightly worse haircut, that's all. And it was at that time, this was 1985, that I joined the Royal Engineers, and I actually made the decision when I was 15 years old to join the Army, and then I joined when I was 16 and 1 month, so I was pretty young when I actually joined, and I was one of the youngest people in the regiment at the time. And the reason I joined the Army has taken me years and years to sort of suss out. I had this fantasy of what it was going to be like, and that fantasy was something that has reoccurred throughout my work, and it was questioning the reality of what it's like to do something compared to the sales pitch that you get in advance of doing it, and this particular case of being a soldier. And this fantasy was sort of fed to me from a whole myriad of sources, one of them being a lot of my older relatives, and I'm sure some of you have got relatives who've served in something like the Second World War or the Gulf War or the Iraq War or something. And they talk to you about it, and quite often they talk to it with great affection and fondness and great memories of quite a horrific event for a lot of people. Particularly one of my uncles who died recently was one of the members of Special Forces, and he was over in the Second World War and liberated one of the concentration camps. He was caught by the Nazis, tortured really, really badly, castrated by the Nazis before he eventually escaped. So he didn't have as fond memories of his time at war, but he certainly had a lot of fond memories of the military itself. So the castration part I found out after I joined the Army, otherwise I may have been slightly put off. But talking of which, the next part is what I did. So I joined the Royal Engineers. I was a specialist in plastic explosives. I spent about 3 months working out how to blow up a bridge in Germany. My role at the time was to defend us from the Russians, because the Russians were going to come storming across in the Cold War, take over Europe, and my job was to blow up one bridge. And so I weekly went out with bags of plasticine, because they wouldn't let me play with plastic explosives. I'd stick this plasticine all over the bridge. Someone would come along, inspect it, and go, yep, that blew the bridge up. I wasn't expected to live beyond that point, so I didn't really know what I'd do after that. So I'd take it all off the bridge again, and that was my week's work done. So it was a pretty dull existence, as you can imagine. So I retrained, and I retrained as a paramedic. And I went on a 6-week full-time training course, and then I was fully qualified to be a paramedic. This isn't a picture I've taken. This is a picture of me operating on someone's finger. So they allowed me then, after 6 weeks training, to undertake minor, and I should have been able to undertake quite major surgery like amputation after my 6 weeks training. I was allowed to hand out everything from morphine, penicillin, aspirin, you name it, I was allowed to give it out, which was quite nice because at that period you couldn't sue the Army for medical malpractice. I mean, there's a good theory behind it, because if we went to war and there was a frontline soldier, I was the medic that would go running up with his little medical bag, and I would be the first person to touch the soldier once he'd been hit by something. So the training I got was predominantly in the medical ward. So I'd be an accident emergency with the German hospital staff, and they would actually be showing me how to undertake these types of minor and some of the major operations. Now that was great when I actually got to do some stuff, but unfortunately the soldiers didn't injure themselves very often. So my role was once again becoming a bit dull. So I decided to retrain once again. So I actually went on another 6-week training course, and this time it was a photography course. At the end of the photography course, I had a little exhibition in a library, and one of the officers saw my exhibition in the library, looked at the work and said, hang on a sec, this guy's a medic, he goes out in an ambulance, he sits around doing nothing all day, so why not get him to be the medic and the photographer at the same time? So they did. They sacked the photographer, gave me his darkroom studio, camera equipment, and a budget, and then every time there was an event on, I'd go out as the medic in my ambulance, and providing no one got injured, I'd stand there and take photographs for PR and for British Forces newspapers in Germany. This was a sort of typical thing that I'd be covering. And when I look back at this now, I see sort of an ironic twist on it, because we were so underfunded at the time. Maggie Thatcher put thousands and thousands of troops in Germany. but she didn't have the funds to actually keep us there, support us while we were there. So they complain about equipment missing, but half the guys here don't have gloves, and this is chemical warfare training. But we didn't have the equipment to sort of, the basic equipment just to dress to defend ourselves against chemical attack. But that was the 80s. It was all good fun. Anyway, I graduated, or left, or passed out, or finally escaped from the army, depends how you want to look at it. And at that point, I knew I wanted to be a photographer, or inverted commas, an artist. I didn't really know what the pathway was for me, so I went on and did an Arts Foundation course. After the Arts Foundation course, I applied and got a place here at Coventry University, studying under the Fine Art course. At the time, the Fine Art course was the only course here that actually did photography on it, so I was able to specialise in photography on the course. And a part of that specialism on that course, I got inspired by an artist called Jimmy Pike. Jimmy Pike isn't a photographer. He's an Aboriginal artist, or was, as he's now dead. And I saw his work in an exhibition in London. And at the time I saw his work in this exhibition, I couldn't see a great deal of connection between his work and my work. But I loved the style that he produced. And I was working a lot with mixed media, so I was using photography in alternative ways. So I was doing stone lithography, photo etching, photogravure, those sorts of things, as a way of producing and printing my final outcome work. So I said to the university at the time, I wanted to go off and do a research project based on Jimmy Pike's work and Jimmy Pike. They agreed, and I went off to Australia. I managed to catch up, as you can see there, with Jimmy Pike in Australia. He introduced me to some of his friends, and then I spent the next 6 months living out bush with an Aboriginal community, living off the land, hunting, fishing, gathering food however we could, and learning about the culture. And one of the key things about that experience for me was how their culture develops. Their images, their stories, their lives revolve around the idea of storytelling. And storytelling comes through in their images, the narratives hidden behind the images. And these images help someone progress from childhood to manhood. They help someone understand what it is to become a man in their culture. So I would sit around under a tree in the heat of the day when we couldn't do anything else, and the elders would talk to us and tell us stories which would be information really about how to live off the land. So a long story might be about where to find water, where poisonous waters are found, where snakes tend to live, where the fish come in at the certain time of the year, and they'll be all embodied in an image like we're looking at here by Jimmy Pike. After doing that, coming back here, I presented my research project as a stand-up presentation to the rest of the fine art students. I spent another term here, and I was reaching the end of my second year, and I was really skint at that point. But I was also needing some more inspiration. So I applied for a job working for the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, and it was a competition run through Amateur Photographer at the time. And they had a large amount of applications for it, but because I'd just undertaken this particular project, it set me up as a perfect candidate, really, to take on the job. So I got it. And I took a year off between my second and third year to go and work as the photographer in residence for the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. So I went from two incredible extremes. 1 year I was living out bush, living off the land. The next year I had the opportunity to work alongside Prince Philip and Prince Edward, quite closely. Prince Edward was a few years, not a massive amount, older than me. I got on quite well with him. We tended to do quite a lot of work together, and after a while he started inviting me along to things. And then eventually he asked me if I wanted to go to Africa. So I went off to Africa with him, and we went to Ghana, Gambia and the Ivory Coast on his jet. And I basically just hid in the shadows, went off with him and documented what he was doing while he was out in Africa. Another weird twist was Sophie Rhys-Jones was head of PR for the Duke of Edinburgh's Award at the time. It's also how they met. And I was invited along to the real tennis match where they first met as the photographer by Sophie. So it was a lot younger and a lot more interested in what was happening, or I don't know what it's like now, but at the time he was very interested in what was happening out there in the world. And we just spent a lot of time sort of working, chatting, and enjoying the Duke of Edinburgh's Award as it was then. that was one of the sort of privileged parts of the job. Other things that I got to do was images like we see in front of us here. And this was a sort of typical brief that I would get. This one was on the Bavarian border, I think. And I was sent down there and they said, well, what we want is we want a picture for the Times, a really, really massive panoramic shot of the landscapes down there. We want you to go up with this experienced climber and we want it to look like you've taken up a participant, you're up there climbing, and on one side of the page, this is going in a double-page spread in the Times, and on one page, we want to put text. So we want to have it fairly blank. On the other side, we wanted to have the young participant. But when I got to do the climb, the young participant turned out to be in his mid-40s. And if you know anything about the Duke of Edinburgh's award, the sort of cut-off point, I think, is about 25. So I had to find a way of photographing him so he looked like he was, well, could potentially be 25. Hence the reason I put him into silhouette. So I was hanging off at right angles off the cliff face, shooting this shot, and of course it was 35mm film at the time that I was shooting on, so I had no idea if this was actually working or not, trying to guess exposures for the background and how I was going to silhouette him out. But as you can see, it worked out. So I spent a year with them, a fantastic experience. I spent many years afterwards going back and doing various workshops with them, summer projects with them, and that idea of having a photographer in residence ran for about 8 or 9 years, and sadly it's stopped now, but it was sponsored by companies like Helena, Fuji and Minolta, and Land Rover gave a car as well, so it was a fantastic opportunity. So it's well worth entering competitions. When I arrived back at Coventry to finish my final third year, I got back and I had to come up with a final research project and I had to come back with a final major project. And I arrived back here and several things had changed. One, they dropped the photography option on the fine art course. So I was supposed to be the last year going through with the photography option, but unfortunately because I dropped a year, I ended up being the only person going through with photography, which was quite problematic because there was no one to teach me. But what they had bought is the first 3 computers that they had in the fine arts department, which sounds a bit odd now, but they literally had 3 Macs and that was it. And these were old Macs now. But very low-powered Macs, and they had a version of Photoshop called Photoshop 2 on them, and no one knew what it did. No one knew how to work it, what it was used for, and I had to then think, well, this seems like the future for photography to me. It seems like something I could get into and understand and experiment with, because I'd spent quite a lot of time in industry, I felt, at that point, and I wanted to try out some new ideas and new ways of working. So this shot was shot in a photographic studio, very similar to the one you've got here. This is my final departure shot from my degree course. So these are the majority of my friends. The guy on the right-hand side was one of the lecturers at the time, and the guy in the middle was a paid model on the table. And the original picture scanned in from a book. So the Last Supper picture comes from a book, and the multi-layering was done in Photoshop. This picture was printed out similar to size to we're seeing here. It was just over 1.5 meters wide. It was printed on canvas. It was printed from a 1 meg file, because that's as big as I could handle at the time on the computers. So what happened was, as soon as you printed something up bigger than about a 5x7 print, it just pixelated and looked bloody awful. But by blowing it up onto canvas, and this is printed onto liquid light, by blowing it up and putting it onto canvas, it enabled to soften those edges, to kill off the pixelation that was occurring in those images. So this was my final image, as I say, one of my final images for my degree show, and I was also fortunate that at the final degree show I managed to sell a copy of this final image.